So this is how the talk is going to go. I'm going to briefly summarize the things that we typically do really well, I think, is challenging, deconstructing the idea of economic growth. But then what I want to do that's maybe a little more original is talking about the commodification of happiness and how happiness has become something so profoundly materialistic, and how when we start to deconstruct the construction of happiness, the commodification of happiness, we can start having an environmental conversation that connects our way of life, our way of being well, and environmental problems. And then finally, to be even more concrete, I'll talk about voluntary simplicity before addressing a few points about the things that, of course, I am not discussing in this presentation. As a starting point, I just wanted to remind the audience that the first Earth Day was celebrated in April 22nd, 1970. And so it's frustrating and disappointing to feel that 5 decades later, we're still asking the same questions and concerned about the same problems, and searching for hope and signs that things are actually profoundly changing. And one of the most exciting movement that I found to share with the students is the march, the youth march for the climate that was started by Greta Thunberg in Sweden. Here she is speaking at the Climate Change COP24 conference just a couple months ago.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of climate justice now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet.
So I'll stop here. I'll let you research her and listen to her many presentations available online. She's fantastic. So she just said you only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you're too scared of being unpopular. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing here today, is talking about alternatives to the big economic growth that we hear from the far left to the far right pretty much is the solution to all our problems. We're being told that trickle-down effect will benefit the poor and will solve social inequality. We're being told that we need to generate more science and more money to fund science to fix environmental issues. But sociologists do a good job, have done a good job in the past deconstructing these myths. We, in those classes, typically look at the problems related to GDP, the way GDP measures things and what is measured and what is not accounted for in GDP. We talk about the environmental Kuznets curve. We talk about the Netherlands fallacy. We study the Jevons paradox. And really, we're pretty good, I think, at demonstrating that no, economic growth has not provided peace and love in the world. Indeed, despite economic growth since the 70s, social inequality has only increased. And now we know, to come back to our main topic here, that with economic growth systematically comes uh, increased environmental degradation. And here we are, every year we break the overshoot day earlier and earlier. And we've known for a long time now that economic growth and environmental sustainability did not go together. In 1972, so only 2 years after the first Earth Day, the limits to growth demonstrated, put together the numbers showing that population growth, economic growth, as long as growth was exponential, uh, just could not work. We could not exponentially grow forever on a finite planet. And the conclusions of the limits to growth were that we were on a trajectory to disaster, and that it was necessary to put together the conditions for economic and ecological stability, that the state of global equilibrium could be designed so that the basic material needs of each person on Earth were satisfied, and each person would have an equal opportunity to realize their potential. But this had to happen outside of the only framework that was proposed to us, that is economic growth. Where we came up with this is where we came up with this idea of sustainable development. And the problem with sustainable development is it is still based upon the idea that the economy should grow. That in the top left quadrant of the Venn diagram, we still have job opportunity, wealth creation, assuming that those will come from economic growth. So here we are, faced with only one option, I think, is to actually talk about economic degrowth, to step out of this model that is the only model that's ever been presented to us. When the limits to growth was just published, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen had just published his book, The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, in which he combined physics and economics to make a profound statement about economics. He concluded that based on the second law of entropy and the fact that energy is always lost in any kind of manufacturing or transformation process, growth was not possible forever. And therefore, he claimed that a steady state of economy, or as he coined it, degrowth, was absolutely necessary in the long term. So things get really fun once I introduce the word degrowth in a class. It typically opens up a world of excitement because at this point, students start to question absolutely everything. And so it's a process we go through together, and we talk about our habits and consumptions and values and behaviors. And one by one, we can deconstruct, change, think about alternatives. Those are a few topics that we touch on, and I'm going to mostly focus on sobriety now, but we can talk about production and exchange, and how to do things to recycle, to repair, to do things outside of the consumer market. We talk about production and so generation and consumption of energy. We go in depth into the topic of localization. What is local? How to make things local? But for now, I'm mostly going to talk about sobriety. The topic of degrowth by itself could easily fill up a semester if we think of how Eric Olin Wright used to organize his seminars around the idea of utopia and how to overcome and go beyond capitalism, we could do the same thing focusing on degrowth. So those are some of the ideas that were suggested to me by Ryan Gunderson, who actually has a book coming up soon on the topic of degrowth. You can find it in the references. So since growth is predicated upon the treadmill of production and therefore the treadmill of consumption, at this point it's time to tackle the beast of materialism. And students really enjoy those kind of conversations. We talk about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations and drivers in life. We talk about what makes them happy, how they project in the future, and how they think they can measure someone's success. And there's lots of social psychology work out there that shows that actually when people have more strong materialistic value, and so therefore they pursue financial success and they want to have nice possessions. They focus on the right image and status. Then they are more likely to be disappointed and to be frustrated and to be unsatisfied and unhappy. Indeed, we know that the levels of happiness do not correlate with the average income. Lots of studies have shown that beyond a minimum level of income, once basic needs are met, people do not describe being any more happy. And here is where I really dive into the fun topic of happiness and the social construction of happiness. We don't lack opportunities and examples to demonstrate and teach the concept of social construction in sociology. But this one is a fantastic one because it's something we can all talk about. A very brief search on the internet shows that happiness is absolutely everywhere in the most absurd commercials. Everything's supposed to be happy, from that woman in the middle selling a water bottle to the McDonald's meal or the car. Everything is about to be happy. There's also the countless pages of books about happiness on Amazon. And Juliet Shore has a fantastic piece that typically the students really enjoy, showing how when it comes to consumption and satisfaction, social context is really much everything. Then being French, I have a lot of fun discussing with the students the topic of wine and how, based on a few studies and also a video produced by Vox, how people are more or less likely to enjoy wine once they know the label or the cost of a bottle. And this goes even for sommelier. Wine judges, people who are professionally trained, are also greatly influenced by the price of the bottle. And then finally, when we talk about a social construction of taste and judgment, there's of course this masterpiece by Pierre Bourdieu that probably is not good for the students to read, but definitely something worth mentioning. There's a lot of information in there that is still extremely relevant when we talk about the social construction of happiness and taste. So at this point, it becomes clear for the student that happiness, which is a physiological state, there are hormones involved in it, is something that is heavily conditioned by society and social norms and advertisement. And when it comes to the impact of advertisement, I encourage you all to, if you don't know it, to watch this BBC documentary, The Century of Self. And in the first part of The Century of Self, Edward Bernays is portrayed, and he's broadly considered the founder of PR. And in that documentary, they describe really well the impact that advertisements, commercials can have on people's psyche, and where this drive to buy and to consume comes from. Yet we know that because of the hedonic treadmill, the adaptation to consumption, and the fact that the social environment is so important in determining how we feel about ourselves when we are driven by materialistic values, we know that actually what makes people happy is not stuff. What actually intrinsically, deeply makes people happy are family relationship and financial situation, sure, stability, work, but mostly how meaningful work is. And then community and friends, and we're back to the same point, family relationship. And then health, and then personal freedom and personal values. Those are things that one cannot buy. Um, but once we realize that um, happiness is not necessarily founded on materialistic values, on stuff, and one does not need to own more stuff to be happy, then we can start thinking about not using stuff, not buying stuff, and yet being happy. And this is where I make the connection between environmental sustainability and happiness and degrowth. And this is where the magic happens, really, when one understands that by moving away from materialistic value, we're more likely to be happy and at the same time to have a much lower environmental footprint. Now, let me briefly introduce you to this young man. Thomas was a student of mine when I started teaching elementary school, and he's now 23. This summer, Thomas was supposed to come visit us in Colorado until he played around with a calculator, an environmental footprint calculator, and realized that one single trip across the ocean would double his CO2 emissions for the year. And at that point, Thomas made a bold, very courageous, and totally unexpected move and decided to let me know that actually he felt too bad about it and would not fly over the ocean. He did not make that decision because it was too expensive, because he could not afford it. Thomas is financially stable at this point, and he could come see us, and he has in the past, but he decided to back off. He decided to not take a vacation because he did not need it. And this is the point of voluntary simplicity. Probably all of us here listening to this video have more have a greater environmental impact that a lot of people in developing countries do. And it's on us to make the decision to lower our environmental footprint. So how can we do that? A few solutions are I like to play around with in class is transportation. Whether you decide to not fly over the ocean, or you, as an adult, decide to travel across New York City on a scooter. Not expected from an adult with a full salary, and yet that's a decision, that's an option you can make. Another topic I love to discuss is housing. So whether you decide purposefully to downscale the size of your house and you go on purpose for a tiny house, or maybe even better, you actively seek a co-housing situation, you have a great impact on your environmental footprint when you make this kind of decision, and you live closer to people and you secure social bonds. And finally, there is another point that is extremely empowering and lowering our environmental footprint, and that is eating a plant-based diet. I did not make up a slide for that. It's simple enough. Um, so to conclude, because I run out of time, I know I have not addressed a lot of topics. I have not talked about the government, about the role of protection environmental agencies. I have not talked about social movements. Um, but all those things we discuss through the semester, and what I find is the students are really grasped by this topic of questioning what actually makes them happy, what they need, what they don't need. It's actually very trendy currently because Marie Kondo has a Netflix show on tidying your house, getting rid of stuff. There are several blogs and books about minimalism. There's a fantastic read on digital minimalism by Cal Newport that I'm going to put in the references that talks about also the dangers of the new technologies and the attention economy. And so I think just having this conversation gives the students a tool to leave the classroom and actually do something right away. I know some will consider that this is a very neoliberal way to address environmental issues because it's focused on individuals and it is not addressing the larger structures, the economy, the government. Um, but those things I discuss, it doesn't mean those are not mutually exclusive. And I think the question of minimalism and this power we have to make the choice to not fly to to Santa Barbara to do a conference, or to not fly across the ocean to see a friend, is extremely important and extremely helpful, because otherwise we're left with the same behaviors that we had 50 years ago, and we're left wondering, oh, how come we haven't made any progress since the first Earth Day? Because it's on us, on every single one of us. It's on Finland and Sweden and the tiny countries and every one of us to actually make those decisions. So thanks a lot for listening to this talk. If you made it all the way here, I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments and sharing resources. The next slide will be a long list of references. Thanks again.